I always try and talk about various aspects of the Neptunia series that I find interesting, but often there are things that I don't get to talk about in the reviews though, so in order to do that, I thought of doing this, the best and worst of the Neptunia series. The thing is that stuff like, ranking videos and tier lists are basically a result of averages, and I don't think I always highlight the peaks and valleys or the extremes that games often have. Hopefully this best and worst format will bring out some interesting topics. I have various categories we'll be going through, and some are pretty obvious, like best and worst, gameplay, graphics, and story, but there's some other more interesting categories too. On top of that, I'll split it into mainline games and spin-offs. Some people don't agree what a spin-off is or isn't, though it's pretty obvious as far as I'm concerned. So for the sake of this video, a spin-off is something that the developers officially consider a spin-off. So a spin-off may be part of the main story or not. The main thing is that the gameplay deviates from what we know in the mainline games. That's basically how that works. And just so you know, there's no mobile games or anything like that, or no Neptunia shooter. Just the actual games. And also remember, this is all my opinions, so even if you don't agree with something, the point really is to discuss and highlight certain things about the various games. So even if you disagree, I hope you still find this interesting. Let's start with the best and worst gameplay. For mainline games, the best gameplay as far as I'm concerned is Mega Dimension Neptunia V2. It's the most refined turn-based battle system the series has seen. There's a decent balance with difficulty, and there's lots of good fun stuff like nice transformations, special attacks, and things like that. There's also noticeable improvements with dungeon design. Overall, it's a pretty good experience that feels relatively jank-free compared to previous experiences. It was quite exciting when this game came out around 8 years ago. It really felt like the series was advancing and getting better and better. It started also to feel less budget. Too bad we didn't know about the stagnation of the mainline games that was upon us. The mainline title with the worst gameplay has to be the original PS3 version of Hyperdimension Neptunia. It was based on another game called Trinity Universe. By the way, just a random fact, Trinity Universe may be the first game in history to use live 2D. I don't know if that's true. If you know of anything that came before, then I'd love to see a comment there. It's something I've been curious about for a while. Neptunia on the PS3 was just tedious. Awful dungeons that feel dead. There's no enemies to be seen anywhere. It wasn't even that they randomized encounters. Encounters were actually based on distance traveled, so you could predict where approximately a fight would start. I don't know why exactly, but I found that maddening. Though eventually with experience you'd be able to cut out 1 or 2 fights by hitting the apexes, if you know what I mean. The battle system was clunky too. Strange idle animations and lots of jumping around ended up looking quite strange. The weirdest, but at the same time a very interesting part of the game was that item usage was based on probability. It wasn't always that easy to get the balance right, because if you set the percentage too high, you'd obviously waste resources. On the other hand, if you do it the other way around, and you set it too low, you could just end up dying, kind of pointlessly, even if you have enough items, so yeah. Now to the best spin-off gameplay. A bit of a tricky one and perhaps controversial because of all the bugs and strange wonky moments it has. You may have guessed just from that description, but it's Cyberdimension Neptunia 4 Goddesses Online. I like the hack and slash gameplay. Yes, there's buggy parts about it, but I quite enjoyed the basic concept of it all. It was fast-paced and fluid. I thought the dungeons were really cool too. Not only were they usually larger than most dungeons in the main games, they also look way better with nicer textures and more interesting layouts. It actually applies to almost everything in the game, except the cutscenes. Those were strangely stationary, or at least no live 2D anyways. I wish they went ahead and tried to refine the formula in other games. They did do other real-time Neptunia games, but they never really felt like they were based on this game, and they never looked this good. As for the worst gameplay for a Neptunia spin-off, is there any doubt? It must be Producing Perfection for the PlayStation Vita. If there was an ironic name award, this game would win it too. It's an idle management game, sort of thing, but I think it's badly executed. There could have been ways to make the game more interesting, for example, where you control the lighting and effects during a performance. That could have been massively made better and more engaging, but instead everything just kind of feels tedious. Now I bet some of you are going, well, this is a very obvious choice. Producing Perfection is always being called the worst game in the series, so maybe how about picking another game? Alright, I'll give you second and hopefully more interesting choice. And that is Super Dimension Neptune versus Sega Hard Girls. It is technically not just a spin-off, but also a crossover with the Sega Hard Girls franchise. You know, Sega consoles made into human form. So yeah, obviously there's a very big crossover in terms of the concepts with those two. While having a really good story, the gameplay of this game is so lackluster at best and awful at worst. The battles have been reduced to just pressing one attack button for the most part, while still being turn-based, and it just has the wonkiest additions. Things like jumping to collect stuff feels incredibly clumsy, not to mention the added platforming. Not only does it feel awful, some of the animations like climbing are a tragedy to behold. The thing is, the game looks like a normal NEP game when you first see it, so you think, oh, I know what to expect. But then as you play it, you really feel how unrefined the gameplay is. I know other people find some of the other spin-offs worse, but I think the other ones at least ended up having distinctive, interesting things going on. Neptune vs. Sega Hard Girls feels like they took a Rebirth game, did weird stuff to the gameplay, and then left it in a beta stage before releasing it on the public. Too bad, because the story was pretty interesting. On the topic of storylines, for the best storyline in the main series Neptunia game, I'm gonna go with the original Hyperdimension Neptunia. Probably not a surprise if you follow the channel. That's the original PS3 game, not the Rebirth 1 remake. But I do think there are several games in the series that have great storylines. The original game is still the best for me. While other NEP games can sometimes reach the level of satire and parody of the original, there's several things that the original just does best. Later games often end up being overly self-referential for humor purposes, but the first game obviously can't do that because, it's the first game, so I quite like that. It's more about highlighting tropes and cliches of other games and the video game industry instead of going, hey, remember this character quirk I have? Here it is again. Another reason the original Neptunia game is great is because everything was new. The whole amnesia thing was used as a way to introduce the player to the game world so you can discover the game world together with Neptune in a natural way. The goddesses were also not really friends with each other, so you never really know if they would even cooperate at all or become friends or whatever. Overall, the story feels well constructed and the humor wasn't too reliant on gimmicks. Rebirth 1 doesn't really have that feel as the original. Plus, they changed the story around. But we do know that it's because of necessity, because of the maker characters, but that's just the way I see it. I'll also give a shout out to the second game, Hyperdimension Neptunia Mark II, and I guess by extension, Rebirth 2. I think those games did a good job of introducing the CPU candidates, and technically, that's also where the real start of the storyline is of the main games, since the original game and Rebirth 1 are set in the Super Dimension. So with that said, I'll say the worst storyline in a mainline game is Rebirth 1. The thing is, it's actually not bad. It's just that it's just not the same as the PS3 story that I loved, and it's just changed around too much. And some of the humor doesn't feel right in comparison. The other Rebirth games stuck a bit closer to the original games, so I don't really have as strong negative feelings about them. But yeah, that's just how I see it. How about best spin-off storyline? Now this one's controversial because it wasn't very popular. Super Neptunia RPG. The reason I like this one is that it has a lot of the feel of the original PS3 game when it comes to the story. Super Neptunia RPG, like the original PS3 game, presents you with an unknown world. I think that really draws you into the story. I also like how the story reveals itself by showing you bits of familiar things we know from the regular Neptunia games. This layer of mystery is a nice thing to have hanging in the air, and it's also mostly missing in other Neptunia games. Now onto the worst spin-off story. A bit of me wants to poke at producing perfection again, and when I say a bit of me, I mean all of me, but I don't really know the story because, well, to be honest, I haven't really played the game because I thought it was awful to play, so yeah. Instead, I'm going to go with something else, and that is Neptunia U Action Unleashed. I actually got all the trophies for this game on the Vita, but it took me a while to even recollect anything when it comes to the story. It's just really not that memorable compared to other spin-offs, though I don't think there's anything particularly awful going on there with Neptunia U's story. I actually remember character interactions to at least be quite alright, and while it does flesh out characters like Famitsu and Dengekiko, the story is a bit hampered by the fact that it's just really short, maybe it's like 3 or 4 chapters, if I remember correctly. It doesn't have the scope that many of the other games have, while also not being as unique as the other spin-offs. But at the same time, that made it kind of easy to get all the trophies for, so yeah, that's the thing. Also, it had clothing damage, so that's cool. Now let's talk visuals, the best and worst graphics. The main title with the best graphics in my opinion is Mega Dimension Neptunia V2. It was an excellent improvement compared to Victory and Rebirth 3. There's just so many things that were made better. The world looks better with its new dungeons. The menus were overhauled and made nicer, especially compared to the Rebirth games, which all suffered a bit from being, oversized looking because it's, how it is. It's a Vita interface on non-handheld devices isn't great. Not to mention, because there were Vita games, they just looked really pixelated and stuff. But there's other things too, like animations became better. The transformation sequences were excellent. Remember, the Rebirth games didn't even have them. And the special attacks were also fancy and fun to look at. Basically, almost everything that could have been called wonky or unrefined was to some extent better than V2, which made it feel remarkably less like a budget game than past entries. And stuff like the different team attack mechanics and those giant battles also added something new to the fights. It would be easy to say the worst looking mainline title is the original PS3 Neptunia game. Another easy one, or three, would be the Rebirth trilogy. Compared to Victory on the PS3, the Rebirth games looked worse, and the PC versions looked quite bad with all the Vita menus and textures. Plus 3 games in a row that looked the same and played the same isn't amazing either. Mega Dimension Neptunia V2R was another potential candidate, but it doesn't really look bad, it's just that it looks worse than V2, despite being a remake. The entire game is a massive sidestep for no reason at all, but in the end, the worst mainline Nep game in terms of graphics has to be Hyperdimension Neptunia Reverse, can't remember how it's pronounced right now. It's a PlayStation 5 port of Rebirth 1, so yeah, obviously it looks better than Rebirth 1 does. For a game that's on the PS5, they really didn't make much of an effort to make the game look good. Basically all PS4 and Switch Neptunia games look better than this supposed PS5 game, and yeah, that's pretty bad. Putting some filters over a Vita game and then adding some puddle reflections don't make a game magically look several generations newer. So while this isn't the worst looking one, it definitely was exceptionally disappointing considering it's a PS5 game. Best graphics for a spin-off game goes to Cyberdimension Neptunia 4 Goddesses Online. Despite the bugs and wonky things that can happen, 4 Goddesses Online generally looked really good. Lots of varied landscape and terrain. There was a good atmosphere going on, and there wasn't that flat Vita lifelessness we were used to seeing. The menus also had a unique look that we normally don't see in Neptunia games, and I also like the various UI references to online gaming, like the chat box and how the special attacks are laid out on the screen there. I had a bit of a hard time deciding which spin-off game is the worst, graphically speaking. A lot of the Vita games just by default look not exactly great. And there's some games that don't really look ugly, but they were disappointing for whatever reason. So maybe let's just go with something that was a bit disappointing. Stuff like Sisters vs. Sisters and Game Maker Revolution being capped at 30, and then on the PS5 not reaching 60 frames per second. The PS5 version and also the Xbox Series X versions should look and run better. At the very least, the PC version runs at 60 FPS of Sisters vs. Sisters, so yeah, there's that. But yeah, I guess I'll go with those games. And now let's take a look at the best and worst PC ports. Now let me say that this category isn't necessarily a technical analysis, and I'll explain that with the first game, or games. For the best mainline game PC port, I'm going to go with the Rebirth trilogy, and obviously that's not because of technical reasons, because it's actually because the series benefited so much with those ports being made. Back when only very few people watched this channel, I remember I made a Rebirth 1 review, obviously of the PC port there, and it really didn't get many views, but whatever, that's fine. It was a fun video to make. And then one day I noticed that viewership numbers were suddenly spiking on that video, and I noticed that there was a Steam sale going on there. So it turned out a lot of people wanted to see if the game was worth trying, which is fair enough because, nobody really knew what that series was back then. So that port, along with Rebirth 2 and 3, brought a whole bunch of people into the series that would have never gotten the original PS3 games or the Vita remakes. Essentially, they found out there was a pretty big untapped market, which is why so far every game released since then has a PC port, with the exception there being Game Maker Revolution, but I'd be very surprised if that didn't get one. Usually PC announcements lag behind. Now, in terms of being a quality PC port, the Rebirth games aren't like super amazing, obviously. The Vita-ness is all over the menus and textures. I've already mentioned this in a couple of other categories there. Not to mention there was basically no decent keyboard and mouse controls, if I remember correctly. It was definitely meant to be played on a controller there. And there's no real graphical settings and adjustments that you can do, except for like basic stuff for, like resolution and full screen mode, borderless, whatever. So what about worst mainline PC port? Honestly, it's hard to single out one in particular. There's always weird stuff going on with Japanese niche games and PC ports. The Neptunia series obviously is no exception in that regard. There are various examples where things are just a bit weird, like V2 stuttering on the PC on occasions for no reason. I think you can actually fix that by installing it on a SSD, which obviously these days is not really much of a drama. Graphical settings and keyboard and mouse controls are still being neglected to this date. You could argue that the Rebirth games are the worst because those are clearly Vita games that haven't been graphically optimized for PC. So I guess we'll just go with those because I like the idea of the same games being both the worst and the best in the same category. For the best spin-off PC port, I'll go with Cyberdimension Neptunia 4 Goddesses Online. The reason is because it runs so much better on the PC than it does on the PS4. It just benefits a lot by being on the PC. Stuff like the PS4's original awful loading times are not really that much to worry about anymore. And also the fluctuating frame rate stuff is no problem either. So yeah, the experience on the PC is just much better with that game. There's other games we could pick on too if we wanted to, like Sisters vs. Sisters running at 60 FPS on the PC instead of 30 on everywhere else. But I think 4 Goddesses Online was a much larger improvement in more categories. Now for the worst spin-off PC port, that's a tricky one. Maybe I'll just pass on that. Not because there aren't any bad PC ports, but because the series, it's very common to have, all kinds of issues with ports. So I'll just mention some common themes. Lack of proper keyboard and mouse controls is common. Graphics are usually not customizable. In the past, with Vita games, it was also very common for PC ports to have, not updated textures, so everything was very smoothed over looking and low res. Yeah, stuff like that. These aren't exactly high budget games, and therefore a lack of optimization on the PC is very apparent. Now, I want to bring up best and worst limited editions. This is specifically North American LEs because, well, that's where I'm situated. I have them all except for Rebirth 1 since that was super limited and I didn't manage to get one. For me, the best mainline LE was back in the NISA days with Hyperdimension Neptunia Mark II. It left quite an impact. It wasn't like the first game which had this standardized look. It had a super clean look free of any of the branding and barcodes and text. Just nice and big illustrations front and back. So you could actually just, present it either way, which I think is cool. If you look at it from the perspective of there only being one Neptunia game, and then this LE coming out, I think you'd understand that this felt like a big upgrade. Maybe the worst mainline LE would have to be the first one. It's not super impressive and not much was included with it. Not the most impressive thing when it comes to, being an LE there. One of the best things about spin-offs is that they provide some good opportunities for unique limited editions. I'm actually having a tough time coming up with just one best spin-off LE. 4 Goddesses Online has an excellent looking box with great art, and so does Neptunia RPG, because, they both have the fantasy look going on. And then there's also Virtual Stars, which has a great art style and artistic direction, I guess. It has some nice game-specific outfits, and there's also a more colorful than normal color palette going on. And of course, there's a vinyl record. That pink and purple marbling effect also looks really great on the record. Because the item is so unique and of good quality, I will go with Virtual Stars. Even though the other two previously mentioned games I found excellent too in the limited edition department. But Virtual Stars has a bit of a wow factor since the record is just so cool, and also because of its striking color. Overall, a good looking thing, and another bonus for having nice designs that differentiate the items in the LE, because, some limited editions often just have the same image on all the different things, and that's not amazing. The worst spin-off LE, I think, is Producing Perfection. Honestly, it didn't have that much cool stuff in it. Firstly, an idle game without a soundtrack is mad somehow. But even worse is, or just as bad maybe, is that they included a set of headphones which just sound absolutely like ass, pardon my language. For a game that's about music and idols, that's just not great. Oh, what's this, a microfiber cloth? Yeah, it's got one of those too. That's exciting. Next category is game-specific outfits. I think this is an interesting one. Some games have outfits for characters that are just unique to the game, occasionally in the main story, but more often in spin-offs. And I think that goes without saying that this is about game-specific outfits for recurring characters. Not one-off characters, obviously, because then, yeah, well, by definition, they wouldn't be game-specific because the entire character only appears in one game. But anyways, for mainline games, I will go with Hyperdimension Neptunia Victory, the PS3 game, not Rebirth 3. I'll get to why in a bit. Victory was interesting because they gave the goddesses from the other dimension different outfits in order to differentiate them from the normal ones. Now, why does Neptune have a new outfit for the game despite being from the regular hyperdimension? Who knows? But it certainly left an impact on the series. The outfits ended up being used on a lot of different stuff, like for example, Hyperdimension or Hyperdevotion Noir rather, and also various different mangas, light novels, and also in the anime. Obviously, these outfits exist in both Rebirth 3 and Victory, so why did I go with Victory specifically? That's because that game, as well as Mark II, had a feature called Costume Canvas, and you could give CPUs and CPU candidates custom skins, and obviously, that's an excellent feature. They did not include that function in the remakes or any later games, so that's a shame. I guess they didn't like that it was easy to just do some, put some inappropriate skins on the characters. Now, there can't be really a worst for this category because not all games have specific outfits, so I'm just gonna skip this worst bit for this category here. If you want, just include the Rebirth games for removing Costume Canvas, I guess. Now, the spin-offs, they often have some unique and interesting outfits going on. Mega Tag Mention has school uniforms. The Sega Hard Girls crossover has a cool outfit for IF, though that's just one character. Goddesses Online has a fantasy-style thing going on, obviously. And even Producing Perfection does well in this category because of the idol outfits. But when it comes to idol outfits, Virtual Stars does quite a bit better. I think the outfits are a bit more unique and tailored to each character. And the game does a good job of highlighting these outfits, with also like the dancing minigame thingy. And it's just also fun to mention that Vert has an excellent idol animation in this game, so yeah, that's always worth bringing up. When it comes to the worst game-specific outfits for spin-offs, I guess, it's kind of like the other category too. We just have to maybe mention a game or some games that just don't have any unique outfits. I'm not talking about optional outfits. I'm talking about just like, alternate outfits that are just used for that game specifically. So I guess we could say Super Neptunia RPG, Neptunia U, or maybe Sisters vs. Sisters, those kind of games. Now, let's see what the most innovative Neptunia game is. The most innovative Neptunia mainline game for me is actually the second game, Neptunia Mark II. The reasons are pretty simple. The core mechanics of the battle system, how dungeons and exploration works, and various game mechanics are all introduced in this game. Even things like music. The first game was a reskinned Trinity universe, so despite being the first game, it can't really be called innovative in the gameplay department. But Mark II set the standard, and later Victory refined the formula a bit more and made people think, yeah, this series is really improving and it might even be going somewhere. On the other end of the spectrum, the least innovative games in the series could be another multi-game answer with the Rebirth trilogy, but I'm going to go with something else here. And that's going to be Mega Dimension Neptunia V2R. That's the remake of V2. I think it's just such a colossal step sideways and back again. Okay, it has some cool stuff like the VR events, but other than that, it's just the V2 story, except you only get to, there's only one ending you can get. And the graphics took a step backwards in many ways, while only improving in a few areas. But overall, it looked worse than V2, not to mention the performance was way worse on the PS4. And then there's the gameplay. The moves and attacks having to be selected through a menu and then confirmed to be executed is very tedious compared to how it just normally works. I think this game has no reason to exist. It's a massive investment into something useless, especially at a time when people were tired of remakes. It really killed the high that V2 created for the series, and we haven't had a mainline game since. We still don't know whether the next mainline game will feature these silly gameplay changes or revert to how things were in V2. Now, the most innovative spin-off is a game we already talked about, Cyber Dimension Neptunia 4 Goddesses Online. Yeah, blah blah blah, it's buggy and all that, but the graphics just look really nice. It has a nice fantasy world, unique game, there's also unique game music and character outfits. And yeah, this formula showed a lot of promise despite all the bugs, and it just flowed well when you played it. The least innovative spin-off. Now, that took me a while to come up with an answer there. Maybe Sega Hard Girls because it looks like the Rebirth games, but with awful gameplay mechanics. Blonde and Neptune vs. Zombies was for me it was for the most part Neptunia U, but with a new coat of paint. But I still think the setting and story was interesting. Even Game Maker Revolution can be mentioned because it feels so close to Sisters vs. Sisters, because obviously that's what it's based on. But I'll go with another game instead we haven't talked about, and that is Neptunia X Senran Kagura. For a crossover, it just doesn't feel like a game that highlights either series well. It's a hack and slash game. It seems to be based on Senran Kagura games, or maybe, Neptunia U or Blonde versus Zombies. But instead of mixing Senran Kagura's fan service and Neptunia's shenanigans, we just get a game that plays like a simplified Senran Kagura game with basically almost no real meaningful fan service. The disappointment is quite large because of that, so I think it has to be the worst because of that. Imagine how good this could have been, but no, we just have a forgettable and watered down hack and slash instead. So far, Neptune being a playable character in Peach Beach Splash is still the best crossover thing these two franchises did, and that is sad. Alright, let's mix things up a little. Best and worst games that don't have Neptune as the protagonist. I'm going to count both spin-offs and mainline games together for this category. It's kind of hard to split it all up. For best, I'm going to go with Mark II and Rebirth 2. I think Nepgear is a great character and she shows a lot of character development throughout the story. Not to mention Mark II and Rebirth 2 are where the main series technically starts. And Sisters vs. Sisters does a decent job of showing how much she's matured as she's thrown into a situation with a lot of similarities to Mark II. For the worst game with a non-Neptune protagonist, I'm going to go with Hyper Devotion Noir. That grid-based, turn-based spin-off featuring Noir. Now, it's not that I don't think Noir is main protagonist material, but I'm just not a fan of how the story puts you into the story. I know some people like that and I get the appeal, but in the end I always feel like someone wrote a self-insertion fanfic and then somehow that became the story. So that's a look at some of the best and worst aspects of the Neptunia series. I hope that was an interesting and fun way to look at the series. This video is very much an opinion-based thing from the perspective of someone who's played the game since the very beginning. Other people who started with different games or just value different things are obviously going to have different answers to mine, so I'd like to hear some comments on how you think differently to me. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again in the next video.